welcome everyone to, I should have looked it up, I think maybe the 12th or so, annual Khyentse lecture. Tradition dictates that we begin the evening with a couple of awards before introducing our speaker. So we have one undergraduate award and one graduate award. So I'll begin with the undergraduate award. I won't make her stand up and endure me reading this quite yet, but she'll come up in a minute and receive the award. So this is Yichen Zhu, who is receiving the Khyentse Foundation Award for Excellence in Buddhist Studies. Yichen is currently a third-year student majoring in molecular and cellular biology and the neurobiology track. In high school, she told me, her world studies class had a lesson on religion, and that was the first time she started to really learn about religion. Her first Buddhist studies course didn't come until she got to UC Berkeley when she enrolled in Introduction to the Study of Buddhism with Professor Scharf. She took this class initially just to fulfill her philosophy breadth requirement. That's the way we get most of our students. But as the semester unfolded, she realized just how much she really was enjoying learning about Buddhism. She particularly loved, she told me, reading and understanding the scriptures they talked about in class, learning about the history of Buddhism, and trying to comprehend the related philosophical aspects. So Yichen's wish to learn more about Buddhism made her enroll in Buddhism in Contemporary Society with Professor Blum, who is here somewhere, I think, and to Buddhist Thought in India with Professor von Rosbach the following semester. She also sang the praises of Bob Miller, our graduate awardee tonight, who served as her graduate student instructor. She's always wanted to become a doctor, and so known that her field of study would be in STEM. But studying about Buddhism has made her realize that she's also interested in learning about things outside of this area, enabling her knowledge to be more diverse and more enriched. So now she's going to minor in Buddhist studies. Her plans for the future are to apply for med school this upcoming summer, and most importantly, to take some more Buddhism classes in her senior year next year. So, Yichen, if you could come up, and Sydney J. from the Khyentse Foundation will present the award. Now, Alex von Rosbach will come to the podium to present the graduate award.
So the graduate award is in the name of Padmanabh Jaini, who is one of the two Adi gurus of our program. He is just a couple of miles north in his nivas, in his home, 96 years old, doing very well, but a little bit too frail to grace this event. But it's a wonderful thing that he made this endowment for honoring a particularly outstanding student. And it was a no-brainer for all of us to choose Bob Miller, who is sitting there at the back. Bob joined us 3.5 years ago. He had earned a BA at the University of Illinois. And he then basically became part of the Tibetan Buddhist community. He was an administrator and an educator and a monk himself for 15 years, a very distinguished translator, but somebody who impressed when we had our first conversations with him and he was interested in our program. We were always impressed that he had this very obvious deep commitment to Buddhism, but a commitment that had not in any way made him beholden to the tradition. We always had a feeling this guy can think outside the Buddhist box, even though in some ways he's part of it. And when he joined us, we had very high expectations. We knew that his Tibetan is superb, both his spoken Tibetan and his literary Tibetan. But he kind of surpassed and impressed us by what he did. He's a really excellent Sanskritist, very good in Pali. And he threw himself into studying a further Buddhist language that is not for the faint-hearted. He studied Chinese, did this very intensively and with great success. And it means he's in a wonderful position to pursue Buddhist studies across the different languages, the different traditions. And he's doing this by studying what in many ways is at the heart of the Buddhist tradition, by focusing on the Vinaya. More precisely, he's dealing with a particular Indian tradition, the so-called Mulasavastivada Vinaya, that became the principal Vinaya tradition in Tibet. And part of his project is to actually study the transmission from India into Tibet, how indigenous commentaries and exegesis kind of connected to and took over from India. Of course, he's very well positioned because he himself was a monastic and for a long time member of this tradition. And he's chosen for this project a particular topic that we find very compelling. It's called Nisraya, which is a kind of building of a basis at the beginning of your training, building the foundation, a period that can last 5 or more years and that often people don't really shed that much light on when they study the institutions and structure of Buddhism. Bob has, and Jake mentioned this already, also stood out as a wonderful teacher. He is a coveted GSI, and I've not had the privilege to secure him myself, which would have been wonderful. But I'm very grateful, Bob, for your attendance in my seminars and for all that you bring to them, not only your philological expertise and exactitude, but also the open spirit with which you engage the materials. So I think you're a wonderful and very deserving recipient. I congratulate you on behalf of my colleagues, and we are looking forward to you advancing to candidacy in a couple of months and to writing a wonderful dissertation. Please come.
Okay, thank you, Alex, and Alice is my wife, and congratulations, Bob. So on to the main event, our Khyentse lecture, and I want to begin by thanking the Khyentse Foundation for their support for the past dozen years, not only for my position here, but for this lecture and the awards that we give each year. It's been wonderful to be somehow connected to this foundation and to be working here at Berkeley. So our speaker tonight is Professor Charles Ramble. Since 2009, he's been professor and director of studies in Tibetan history and philology at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in the Sorbonne in Paris. Before that, for a decade, he was university lecturer in Tibetan and Himalayan studies at the Oriental Institute at Oxford University. And I think he continues to hold a position as a university research lecturer there. During those years at Oxford, I was talking about this with him the other day, through his tireless work and really infectious intellectual enthusiasm, Charles built nearly from nothing, one of the top Tibetan studies programs in the world. And it was also during this time, for 6 years, from 2006 to 2013, that he served as president of the International Association of Tibetan Studies. And on top of it all, in 2003, convened the 10th seminar of that body at Oxford University, which was a raucous good time, as most IATS meetings are. Before that, he also held positions at the University of Vienna, Humboldt University in Berlin, Bonn, and other institutions. In his work, Charles straddles anthropology and Tibetology. His work is remarkable, then, for its combination of deep ethnographic experience, drawing on 15 or 20 years of field work, and a broad knowledge of texts and classical and modern Tibetan. He's worked particularly closely with private and community archives in Nepal. He kindly taught a seminar on one manuscript from such an archive on Tuesday. on manuscripts dating generally from the 18th to 20th centuries. Charles works primarily on the Bön religion, as well as Tibetan pilgrimage and the historical ethnography and social history of the Himalayas, especially the district of Mustang in sort of north-central Tibet. And when I say he focuses on the Bön religion, I mean particularly the local and often quite difficult to understand traditions that are found scattered throughout Tibet's borderlands. The quantity and fluency of his knowledge and experience in these areas is really quite remarkable. Beyond all this, though, his articles and books challenge modern scholarly assumptions in multiple ways. He's uniquely sensitive to the disjunctions between the two worlds of lived practice and text, and too, between Buddhism and Bön. And he skillfully introduces us to these disjunctive spaces, negotiating them with precision. Then, too, he's able to get beneath the skin of the rituals he studies, revealing the deeply Tibetan tissues beneath, so that his writings really bring us close to the beating heart of what seems to be pre-Buddhist Tibetan worldviews. Indeed, he probably has a better sense of the nuances of local lived religion along the Tibet-Nepal borders than any other scholar, and has imparted this understanding to his numerous students over the years. In terms of publications, he's been extraordinarily prolific, but just to name a few of his books, he's authored The Navel of the Demonists, Tibetan Buddhism and Civil Religion in Highland Nepal, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2008. Several volumes in a series entitled Tibetan Sources for a Social History of Mustang that came out in 2008, 2016, 2017. In 2005, with Geshe Gelap Jinpa and others, he published Sacred Landscape and Pilgrimage in Tibet, In Search of the Lost Kingdom of Bön, with Abbeville Press. Okay, on that note, let me invite Professor Ramble to the stage to speak on Leaves on the Forest Floor towards a method of mapping the evolution of Tibetan ritual complexes. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much for that extraordinarily kind introduction. Exceptionally, because of the solemnity of this occasion, I'm going to read the text. Rituals don't necessarily remain inert over time, but may produce offshoots that take on a life of their own, or else they may accumulate extraneous elements. It's possible to observe variants of ritual performance and narratives, as well as the divinities and demons involved that resemble one another, but it isn't always possible to determine the relationship between the variants. Thanks to a substantial literary record, we know that the Chinese goddess Kuan Yin is a transformation of the Indian Avalokiteshvara, and not the other way around. And we know that the wrathful form of Avalokiteshvara, Hayagriva, was not such a transformation, but rather a Central Asian horse god, who was later associated with the Bodhisattva. However, in the case of many Tibetan rituals, there is no continuous literary, artistic, or archaeological record that might enable us to trace the evolution of the narratives and associated divinities. We can see that there are varying degrees of resemblance between some of these forms, but we lack the information that would enable us to say precisely how they related. But just as it would be both presumptuous and misleading to propose a genealogical diagram with confident lines between the components, so it seems a pity to forego outlining a tentative plan when we do have some suggestions of kinship, even if it isn't entirely clear to us whether these forms are siblings or cousins, so to speak, or whether they belong to different generations. The approach I would like to adopt here is based on one that was formulated by the linguist Georges Van Driem to represent the Tibeto-Burman language family. The diagram juxtaposed linguistic groups and subgroups that were evidently related, but nevertheless he stopped short of fixing them in a hierarchical order. A simplified traditional map of Tibeto-Burman as a branch of hypothetical Sino-Tibetan, would look something like this, or these diagrams from Grierson. Van Driem, however, proposes what he describes as an agnostic model, as seen in the following diagram. In the caption to the diagram and in the main text, he has the following to say. I quote, "This patch of leaves on the forest floor has fallen from a single tree, which we know as Tibeto-Burman. We can't see the branches of the tree, but we're beginning to see the shadows they cast between the leaves on the forest floor. This schematic geographical representation provides an informed but agnostic picture of Tibeto-Burman subgroups. The patch of fallen leaves on the forest floor provides a more informative framework than a false tree." In the following presentation, the group that is Tibeto-Burman in Van Driem's diagram would be replaced by a Tibetan ritual complex. The development of the ritual complex is not linear. In certain cases, there seems to be a dispersal of constituent elements resulting in very simple, pared-down forms of the ritual. In other manifestations of the ritual, or its associated myths and supernatural beings, there appears to be evidence of clustering or swarming due to the accretion of elements from other contexts. The first case I would like to discuss here is a relatively straightforward one. The point of departure is an enigmatic line contained in a 14th century work, the Gyalpe Katang, that describes the cult surrounding the tomb of the 7th century Tibetan emperor Songtsen Gampo. This work, which makes use of earlier, now vanished sources, describes the corps of ministers who were assigned to take care of the tomb. They were marked, it says, with the sign of the dead, perhaps a brand. And although they wanted for nothing and were liable for neither taxation nor military conscription, they were not permitted to interact with the world of the living. Anyone who strayed inside the precincts of the tomb, once touched by them, was obliged to join their number. The text then contains the following statement. They shall guard the domain of the tomb, the dead house, and the treasures of the tomb. The kings of the frontier barbarians sent Tonak to Pe, central Tibet. The messengers of the kings place it with the corpse of the tomb. Now, in this translation of the passage, Erik Hor, the author of the Yarlung dynasty, 69, has the following note about the term Tonak. Black food, ? May correspond to Toa Dang Nakma, food and officinal plants. In a later translation, Snellgrove and Richardson proposed the following rendering. The barbarians sent miscreants, Tonak, and the messengers of these kings would slink into the corpse in the tomb. Now, the spelling to, LTO, meaning food, is in fact a common deformation of the homophonous GTO, also pronounced to, a term that would have been unfamiliar to Buddhist authors because it denotes a class of Bonpo rituals. Tonak occurs most commonly in the name of the ritual Tonak Gosum, the three-headed man of the black To rituals. This ritual is commonly performed in Himalayan Tibetan communities by Pompo and Nyingmapa tantric lamas as a non-specific exorcism. This is another version of it. Indeed, the text of the ritual affirms that, and I quote, there is no adversity that will not be averted by the performance of this ritual. Let's take a look at it. Yes, so part of it entails inflating the small intestine of a sheep and wrapping it around the effigy. It's a very complex effigy behind all these leaves. Nevertheless, there is nothing in the text or performance of the ritual as it exists today to tell us how, if at all, it might be relevant to the tonak contained in the Gyalpo Kathang. To find what is probably the missing link, we must go all the way to Yunnan and the ritual repertoire of the Dongba priests of the Naxi. In his classical study of Naxi religion, Joseph Rock describes a ritual called Tonak. It was already obsolete by the time he learnt about it. And he was obliged to commission a performance. Two things in particular stand out about this ritual. The first, that it requires an effigy with multiple heads, specifically sets of 3. So here you see the heads that are involved. The other is the assertion by Rock's informants that in early times this tonak was not an effigy, but a real human being who was expelled from the community as a ransom. Such ransom rituals are well documented for Tibet itself. This is a close-up of it. You can see the 3 stacks of 3 heads, making 9 altogether. So Songtsen Gampo has described at length the Lugong Gyalpo, the annual expulsion of a man clad in goatskins who would carry with him all the afflictions of the city of Lhasa, never to be allowed to return. This is another version from Khyentse, an even more bizarre one. It was reported that many of these individuals would die following their expulsion from the city. And we might imagine that such an environment as the Society of Tomb Guardians of Songtsen Gampo, where they would be sheltered and fed for the rest of their lives, would have been an ideal haven for those who were expelled from petty kingdoms that lay within reasonable walking distance. I haven't yet succeeded in finding a Tibetan ritual text featuring a 9-headed version of the tonak that we have in the Naxi example, but I did recently come across something that seems to reinforce the connections suggested above. Many rituals in Tibet make use of this device known as a parshing, a wooden block for making dough imprints of objects, animals, gods, demons, and so forth that feature in the performance. Now, these molds are a sort of labor-saving device that obviate the need to make dough sculptures, known as torma, of the items in question. A recent Chinese publication contains drawings and brief descriptions of a huge number of such images, and one of them is the Minak Gogu. Unfortunately, there's no accompanying description to indicate the function of the effigy in the context of the ritual. So if anybody does find it, please, I'd be interested to know. It wasn't only the cities of Lhasa and Khyentse that maintained such a tradition well into the 20th century. Li Yanche, writing in 1937, describes the annual performance of such a ceremony by the great Gelugpa monastery of Labrang in Ando. At the present time, the same ceremony features a ransom image representing Jamyang Shepa, who founded the monastery in 1709, being cast into the river. Although Chinese residents of the surrounding town have also sometimes been engaged for this purpose. They are not, of course, thrown into the river, but they're given a car and a gift of money, in exchange for which they leave the area for good. I'm grateful for this information to Naljot Tsering, who also provided me with this very short video that I'm going to show you of the ransom ritual for Jamyang Shepa. It does feature the ubiquitous mobile phone at some point, so I apologize for that. Okay. The second ritual I'd like to discuss here is called sinen or shinen. Vampire crushing. So the term for the vampire here is the first syllable, si or shi, depending on which dialect you're speaking. And the translation vampire has been adopted by a number of authors in the West. First of all, I think it was coined by Rolf Stein in an article that he published in 1939. It was then taken up later by David Snellgrove and later by Mimaki, Songtsen Gampo, and others. So I will follow in that tradition and sometimes refer to the demon in question as a si and sometimes as a vampire. Such rituals are quite common in the literary corpus of the Pön religion and the Nyingma school of Buddhism. In the later texts of both traditions, the narrative is relatively straightforward. Vampires arise as a consequence of human beings generating bad karma over a succession of lives and eventually being born into this predatory condition. The original vampires are usually 9 in number in Pompo works and 13 among Buddhists. These creatures set out to prey on humans, especially children and animals, but are challenged by the hero, Padmasambhava for the Buddhists, and usually Shenrab-Mibo for the Pompos. The youngest of these vampire siblings, a girl, enters into a dialogue with the hero who explains the origin of the vampires and the technique for subjugating them, which entails placing an effigy of a vampire inside the skull of an animal and burying it at a specified location. Previously, the soul of the vampire has been trapped into entering the effigy, the linga, where it is then imprisoned. So let me just run through the performance. So this is the preparation of the base. You can tell that this has been assimilated into a tantric form of the ritual. You have the homkung with the linga in the middle. There is a triangular pit that is dug in the middle of the high street. And then the vampire, the soul of the vampire is drawn into the construction in the homkung here by whistling and blowing kunglings and so forth. And then the lama with his purva, his dagger, which he's holding in his left hand, extinguishes its life by stabbing out the flame over here. So this is the very simple, basic explanation of what's going on. And then the paper effigy that contains the soul of the vampire is shot with arrows. And then the whole thing is stuffed either into the skull of an animal or the left horn of a yak. In this case, they're using a horn. Then it's tied up with a black goat wool sack. Sealing wax is applied, and then the lama drops the whole thing into the triangular pit. A fire is made, and that's the end of the ceremony. It goes on for a day and a half, probably. So that's a very brief account of what happens. Now, in these texts, it's clear who is good and who is bad. The malefactors have no chance against the hero, and the plot contains no ambiguities or surprises. The authors of these texts often state in the introduction or the colophon that among their sources there were texts used by village householder priests, dongpön, dong as in village, pön as in priest. Texts that are, according to them, unclear in their meaning and poorly constructed. The aim of writing new texts, in short, is to clarify moral and narrative ambiguities in these sources that have come about as a result of faulty transmission. The 17th century author of one Buddhist version of the ritual, this is Pema Chinle, who was a disciple of the 5th Dalai Lama and was killed by the Dzungas. So he sets out the sources that he has used as the basis of his composition. He points out that in the past, the ritual did not make use of a linga, that is, a paper or do effigy representing the demon that is to be destroyed, but that since it has now become commonplace to include this component, he will do likewise. The inclusion of this procedure seems to be a further step in the alignment of an indigenous ritual with Buddhist expectations by setting it in a tantric framework. This is one of the lingas. In some texts, we see the residue of what may have been the non-tantric form of the rite. As stated above, the ritual concludes with the vampire being trapped inside a linga, inserted into a horn or a skull, and then buried in a pit. In the mythic narrative that precedes some versions of the rite, we learn that the original vampires manifested as a group of baby mice that lived on a glacier, and that it is these that must be destroyed. It may be then, well, let's see the excerpt from here. So the vampire family are being menaced by the hero, Padmasambhava in this case, and one of them turns around to the other siblings and reassures them with these words. So the she told the secrets of their hearts. Do not weep, we are not going to die. There are 7 baby mice which act as our souls, and if those little mice are not dead, even if we are killed, we will never die. And in saying this, they reveal their innermost secret. That group of 7 little mice which carry our souls, during the day they sleep in the empty wilderness of snow, and during the night they sleep in the ocean. They should be summoned from the ocean's depths, inserting them into the 3 skulls of a goat, a dog, and a pig. They should be bound up with crossed woolen threads of 5 colors and pressed down beneath a crossed vajra. So it may be then that an older, or at least a different, pre-tantric version entailed interring a nest of young mice in a skull or a horn. An etymological detail that ought to be mentioned here, and that will become relevant below, is that the Tibetan word for mouse is ji, while the word for child is the homophonous ji. There is another, very different case in which the vampire is unambiguously malign. This is the ritual for the invocation of this character. Sise Bungwa Takchung, little tiger bee, the vampire killing god. Now he is a chimeric figure who specializes in the destruction of she-demons. He's made up of the parts of lots of different animals. I won't go into his iconography now, but anyway. So the narrative in this case, this is contained in a collection that was published by Songtsen Gampo. I don't remember the name of it. It'll come back to me in a moment. So the story is set somewhere in Tibet. There are a couple who have 2 children, a girl and a boy. The husband goes off hunting, and the woman goes to dig troma, potentilla tubers, down at the confluence of the river, the 2 rivers. And she's got nobody to look after the children, and so she gives the children some of her jewelry. She gives them her silver mirror and her conch shell bracelet and various other things, and then she sets off, hoping that this will keep them quiet until she comes back. And as the text says, throughout the morning, the brother and the sister ran about and played with the golden ring and the silver mirror and the conch shell bracelet. But in the afternoon, the children pined. They pined for their mother. They called. They called for the mother. But it wasn't the mother who heard the children's voices. It was the vampire that heard them. So the vampire comes. It kills the children, takes out their hearts, and then retreats to its lair under a rock. Now, in this case, the creature doesn't have the form of a human, but is described as a copper-colored animal the length of a spindle. It is, in fact, a weasel. The hero who later destroys the vampire is neither Padmasambhava or Shenrab, in this case, but a divinity who specializes in eradicating these demons. The narrative bears little or no trace of influence from Buddhism or Yungdrung Pen, shall we say, more Buddhicized Pen, but seems to represent a more indigenous articulation of the myth and the nature of the vampire, an animal that preys on small children. As we will see, the association of si with the death of children and with animal forms is retained in other variants. For now, we may note that the Tibetan term for weasel is se. And this is another performance of the ritual. It's not very clear, but here, instead of the axe horn, they're using a dog's skull for the effigy, and just close to this, there's the skull of a weasel. Now, although the 2 examples of Shinen rituals given above are very different in form and content, they share the feature that the perpetrator is an unambiguously evil predator with no redeeming features. A particularly interesting work in which we are given a different picture of the she is a manuscript, which you see here on top. Well, it translates as the exceptional vampire subjugation ritual taught by Tumpa Shenrab. And until literally a couple of weeks ago, I thought it was the only version of this text, but recently my student Naljot Tsering showed me another one from the cycle of the tantric divinity Gekhe, the Bonpo divinity. So I was intrigued to find this. They're very similar texts with certain interesting differences. Now, although the text bears a family resemblance to other Buddhist and Bonpo texts we've seen, the differences it exhibits are significant. The main text, comprising 35 loose-leaf folios written in headless Ume script, it's from Mustang, the top one, is followed by 3 subsidiary works. Sorry, I only have 2. So this is the main text. The 2 others are entitled Gosi Nempa, the ritual for subjugating vampires of epidemics among cattle. And then the next one is the Chungsi Nempa, the ritual for the subjugation of vampires of infants, 6 folios. The first section is the Shung, the main text, while the other 2 are ancillary works that are to be recited if the purpose of the ritual is to exorcise those particular categories of vampires. If the text is an example of the works that erudite Buddhist authors often categorized as being typical of householder Bon priests and lacking in clarity, we would certainly agree with them. Unlike these scholars, however, I follow the hypothesis that this lack of clarity might be due not to the progressive deformation of a neatly structured archetype, but to the possibility that the work may represent a more archaic style or genre with which these scholars were unfamiliar. Among the features of the text that make it difficult to comprehend, we may note the following. The apparent randomness of verb forms means that there's often no sense of tense or aspect. There's sometimes no indication of the agent of the verbs. The paucity of grammatical particles mean that the syntax has to be supplied, and the relationship between episodes is far from obvious. Some of these features, especially those related to syntactic features, have been noted for certain forms of oral literature from the Himalayan region. Examples include the research of Alexander MacDonald and Mireille Elfer on the Gaine, a caste of itinerant bards, and Anne de Salle on the shamanic songs of the northern Magas of western Nepal. As de Salle argues, contra MacDonald and Helfer, the syntactic impoverishment of the Guyanese songs can't be attributed to the fact that the minstrels are not literate, since they are perfectly able to communicate in everyday speech. It's more likely that the lack of grammatical links gives the lines more autonomy, and these lines may be rearranged by the bard more easily to create innovative combinations. This feature has also been noted by Albert Lord in the case of the lyrics recited by the Albanian rhapsodes among whom he worked, and whose songs are characterized by what he calls a grammar of parataxis. The literary form with which we are concerned here is classified as mang, the usual term in Bonpo literature for the myth that legitimizes and empowers the ritual that is about to be performed. It comes from the verb mawa, to say or to speak. So it's a bit like a saga, which itself is cognate with the English verb to say. Writing of the structure of these mang in the Dunhuang Tibetan corpus, Rolf Stein remarks that these various narratives that are set in different lands are simply inserted without any break or transition into the body of the main ritual narrative. Now, the fact that our manuscript is also characterized by the juxtaposition of such apparently unconnected episodes reinforces our hypothesis that the structure of the work is not merely the result of careless redaction, but rather a significant feature of this genre that deserves closer analysis. Although this isn't the place to undertake a more detailed consideration of the text, I would like to highlight the ambiguity of the vampire herself, a young girl, and her relationship with the vampire vanquishing hero, in this case, Shenrab Miwo. The vampire, a 9-year-old child named Lovely Uncared-For Girl, Maso Lekma. is as much the victim in this case as she is the villain. She's called Maso Lekma because, according to the myth, when she is born, her father considers her to be inauspicious because she's born with her teeth already in place. So he throws her into a pit of ashes where she dies, but her mother brings her back to life again. So she was uncared for, but she is lovely nevertheless. Although the second text that I found recently has a different variation of this name. It calls her Yaso Lekma, the pretty girl with the upper teeth, which gives a rather different emphasis to her character. So to the extent that it eschews conventional Buddhist or Bonpo morality, the text is more reminiscent of the oral myths of the Himalayan shamans. A central relationship here is that between the hero and the main vampire, who is the youngest sister of a set of siblings. In the improved Buddhist and Yungdrungpen versions, as pointed out above, the hero simply overpowers her. But in this case, the hero and the vampire realize that they are actually related as nephew and aunt. And while she promises not to kill humans, he promises not to kill her, as long as she swears an oath to come to his aid in the future whenever he performs a vampire subjugation ritual. During the performance of the ritual itself, the officiating lama assumes the identity of Shenrab and summons this original vampire to assist him, reminding her of the oath that she once swore. This pact is redolent of the foundational covenant central to the mythology of the northern Magha of Nepal, in which the hero, Rama Puransan, promises not to kill his defeated archenemy, the youngest of 9 witch sisters. They too are related as uncle and niece. The motive for Rama's forbearance is the argument made by the young witch. He is a healer, and witches cause illness. And if he kills her, he will lose his livelihood. Our text seems to preserve traces of this sinister covenant between 2 apparent adversaries. The term si frequently appears in texts as si, the homophone. While there can be little doubt that in most cases this is a straightforward error, Rolf Stein develops the intriguing suggestion of an etymological and conceptual connection between the two. We can do no better here than to quote the relevant passage from his article, again my translation. The particular definition of marriage, procreation, descendants, attached to the expression chab, or chu, si, chabsi, leads to a semantheme that is ignored by dictionaries, namely sipa, to procreate. In my opinion, he says, this word belongs to the same semantic field as si, or siu, a demon that particularly devours small children. The second word is defined as follows, he says in Dagyab's dictionary. Chungshi, demon that causes a child to die shortly after birth. Whereas Tseten's dictionary gives it as siu, a small child, so called because its existence, sipa, is small, thereby associating the 2 forms of si. Now, he develops this, but not very much, unfortunately. And his understanding of the precise nature of the relationship between these 2 forms of si, beyond the etymological connection, remains obscure. Now, as regards the relationship between vitality and its depletion, we might add here the observation that, as Anne-Marie Blondeau has pointed out, in certain situations, the si, or siu, the diminutive form, is not the vampire itself, but the child that survives in the wake of the death of a series of elder siblings that it has itself killed, a theme to which I will return in the last section of this presentation. For the time being, the 2 things I would like to retain from this are, first, the concept of shi might be somehow related to the notion of cosmic or political order, and secondly, that si, although usually a vitality-depleting entity, has associations with giving vitality. Let's leave that. Okay. Now, si in certain contexts are metonymic for the nadir, and they must be suppressed, not merely as an act of exorcism, but as a part of a set of activities that entail restoring order to a disordered world. So certain rituals begin with this. In this case, the second C, the nadir, is replaced by the term sin, which also has demonic overtones. In ritual texts, the C always abide in the lowest of the 9 layers of hell. In works that present the cosmos in terms of the 37 vertically ordered levels known as the yen, the category called Si, Srid, occupy the 8th level, or the 1st in certain cases, and the Si, the vampires, the 35th. They are practically the 31st. They're practically at opposite ends of the vertical axis. The role of the priest as a legal figure is alluded to in an important work by Songtsen Gampo, which was the basis for a much better known treatise on Pön by the 18th century Gelugpa scholar Tuken Lobsang Chogyinima. According to this account, the figure who corresponds to Shenrab was abducted by demons and instructed by them for up to 12 years before being reintroduced to the human realm. Thanks to the powers he'd acquired, he was able to determine what kinds of gods and demons inhabited any given country, and to identify the causes of various afflictions, and to recommend or to perform the rituals needed to propitiate the powers that were responsible. So here we have the citation. So later it says, following the death of King Digum, that's the 8th king, at the hands of his subject Lungam Tadzi, he, the priest in question, was invited to perform the Dishi ritual to counter the effects of violent death. But he is said to have replied, although I know a great many of these rituals, Pön, they can be reduced to 3 categories: pressing down or crushing demons and vampires, making offerings to the revered gods on high, and reciting the methods of the law in the middle. I know only these 3 things, and I am unable to perform the rites for subjugating the demons of bad death. Now, although these Buddhist accounts about Pön are often criticized as caricatures by some Western authors and by the Pompos themselves, aspects of them do find a resonance in Pön and historical sources. In the 14th century Ziji, for example, which the Bonpos regard as an authoritative work, is the longest version of the biography, the hagiography of Shenrab Mibo. The Way of the Shen of Illusion, the second vehicle, Nangshen Tekpa, has a section devoted to dealing with vampires. The procedure isn't an isolated one, but is rather paired with the opposite activity of worshipping the gods above. These following excerpts are slightly modified versions of Snellgrove's translation of the relevant passages. So he says there are 12 kinds of cell rituals of purification: the 4 upward cell of increase of the white channel, the 4 downward cell, the 4 intermediate cell, and so on. So for upward, for prospering the feeble, perform the increased cell of swastika being. For replacing poverty with wealth, perform the upward cell of existence in the universal womb. And the downward, if being feeble, one is near one's end, perform the downward cell of the 9 demons and the 10 vampires. Now, I mentioned historical texts. A short textual discovery in Tibet confirms the antiquity of this dual ritual process. The lengthy 100-line transcript of what is believed to have been the text of a now vanished pillar inscription from southwest Tibet contains a passage that deals with procedures for removing the pollution caused by the homicide of a prominent individual. I'm grateful to Dan Martin for pointing this out to me, and to Naljot Tsering for giving me the manuscript, or the photos of the manuscript. So the text, which you see on the left, is attributed to the Emperor Songtsen, and therefore, if it's genuine, is to be dated to the 8th century. Now, the circumstances are not clear, but it seems to be what one does, what has to be done as a consequence of a murder. And it's essentially about the restoration of order. So as the wherewithal, the kien, for worshipping the awesome gods and pressing down the vampires, Sinon, whoever has committed, I don't know if it's homicide or this particular homicide, it's not clear from the text, shall make an offering of, and then male slaves, female slaves, golden arrows, 9 bolts of cloth, turquoise spindle, etc., etc. Yeah, so there are lots of things to be paid by way of compensation, but the purpose of these donations is that they should finance a ritual for setting the cosmos in order by worshipping the gods on high and crushing down the vampires below. We've seen instances of the sea as an animal, specifically a weasel, that preys on young children. More commonly, sea are not usually an isolated category, but they generally feature in sets. In Pompo works, as I said, there are usually 9, although the Ziji, cited above, mentions 10. And in Buddhist works, we find 13. They appear with human bodies and animal heads. Each of them is a different type of vampire, preying on a specific category of victim. The lists aren't consistent, but vary from one text to another. Now here's a table that shows 2 variants. Both of these are incomplete. And practically every text you go to concerning these will have a different configuration. But this is just to give you an idea. So on the left you have the head that this creature has. In the middle it's the category of vampire it belongs to. And then on the right you have what it specializes in, so to speak. So some of them are vampires of bad death, others are vampires that prey on babies, others that hang around tombs, and so on and so forth. Now, as mentioned earlier, in other contexts, the sea are especially considered to predate on young children, irrespective of the form they take. For this particular configuration, the topos of a group of animal-headed demons that prey on young children, we have the intriguing possibility of influence from a certain class of divinities from Khotan. The divinities in question, they're all referred to as goddesses, not as demons, are represented in a collection of miniature paintings in the Stein collection, that's the other Stein, of the British Museum. And I'm indebted to Sam van Schaik for drawing my attention to these. There are only 3 of these slips, painted recto and verso to give a total of 6 figures, but the inscription on one of them specifies that they belong to a class of 16. The inscriptions are bilingual, in Khotanese and Chinese, and the essential features are as follows. Each fiche represents one of a class of animal-headed mountain goddesses, each appearing with a baby. The animals depicted on the available slips are a bull, a cock, a cat, a crow, a deer, and an owl. So in each case, there is a baby. So in each case, the spirit is depicted with a baby that it appears to be abducting or about to abduct. Mauro Maggi, who's published a translation of the Khotanese text of this set, notes that these divinities correspond to a set of 15 demons that feature in the Mahas Sahasra Pramardani, henceforth MSP, one of the 5 texts that make up the Pancharaksha. 2 articles that are important in this regard, Mauro Maggi's article, and then a later one by Gerge Hidash, to whom I'm grateful for drawing my attention to Maggi's article. So according to Hidash, the author of the second article, these are the 5 components of the Pancharaksha, and our text is the first of these. So each of these is dedicated to averting a particular type of it's raksha, it's protection against different types of harm. So this is from the Khotanese text translated by Maggi. And in one case you can see that this is the second one. It's actually a male demon. And in the original text, most of them are male. They're not female. In the Chinese version, they become female. Now, according to Hidash, while the MSP as a whole clearly communicates that the primary function of the Dharanis in this scripture is recitation, in the last section of the text there are ritual instructions with prescriptions of more complex ways to use, including, of course, recitation in the majority of cases. These include sealing the boundaries of the state, the destruction of poison, the removal of kakhordas and vetalas, the protection of fetuses and children. Hidash notes, it's remarkable that the texts published by various authors, including Maggi, all come from this section of the MSP. This implies that copying and using this part must have been an established activity in Central Asia, at least. These manuscripts were likely to have been associated with apotropaic qualities and most probably served as talismanic objects. Now, the Chinese translation, the Chinese inscription translated by Whaley, specifies that these aren't predators but goddesses to whom mothers should make offerings in order to prevent their children from dying. So we can see it here. So 16 female spirits protect small children. But if such children have not yet attained to the age of 12, these 16 spirits transform themselves into evil shapes and upon small children work pain and harm. Under the 16 major spirits, there are numerous small yakshas who may rob small children of their spiritual essence. If you want your small boys and girls to be without sickness and pain, you must always sacrifice to the spirit concerned. Then your small children will recover their health. So they are very ambiguous. The point here is that, well, even though these figures may certainly have the potential to harm children, their primary function is one of protection. Now, I'd now like to consider a similar ambiguity that's to be found in the case of Tibetan vampires. In a 17th century Buddhist Shrinen text that's been translated by Martin Boerd, we're told that, while undertaking the exorcism of vampires, the priest should recite the following 2 lines. There are no leaders greater than the vampires. There is no lineage more ancient than the vampires. In a work that is purportedly about the subjugation of vampires, these lines are incongruous, to say the least. Can we detect in them the traces of a belief that vampires might not always have been regarded as hellish fiends? The next example I want to consider is also a short text from the Mucho Tomdur collection that's been examined by John Bellezza. Mucho Tomdur is a compilation of Pumpo works from different periods that deal broadly with archaic funerary procedures. A full catalogue of the contents of this collection has been published by Songtsen Gampo. Many of the works deal with the procedures to be followed in order to separate the soul, the la, of the deceased from the agents of death that have captured it. Most commonly, the latter are the she, the so-called executioners, although the she also feature extensively as a category that's almost synonymous. While the she appear in most of the texts as stealers of souls, there is one short text, the title is here on the right, La de Sipa, in which the protagonist is a she who has a crucial role not as the raptor, but as the guardian of departed souls. So the text is entitled La de Sipa. In view of the polysemous character of the term Sipa, the title may have a number of possible translations which might include the domain of the soul stone or the Sipa divinity of the soul stone. In short, the text contains the myth accompanying the ritual for the attachment of souls of the dead to standing stones as a temporary abode in which they can be visited and tended by their surviving relatives. And this may go a long way to explain the large number of standing stones on the Tibetan plateau. The verb most commonly associated with vampires is lang, meaning to rise, because they rise up from the lowest depths of hell to plague the living. But here we have the puzzling spectacle of a vampire descending from heaven. Now, I'm going to read an excerpt from this text. It's based on the translation by Bellezza, but I varied it in a couple of significant points. In the beginning, from the lofty and pristine country of the Hla gods, the sea came down to earth to supplement the strength of humans. She came to the surface of the immovable, joyous rock. When she looked upwards, she saw the high, pristine country of the Hla gods. When she looked downwards, she saw the tops of the sal trees. She said, "Here is a boulder." And so the crag also replied in human language, "Yes, there is." On the crag are also the souls of sentient beings. The Lady Sea, Walso Nomo, a name meaning sharp female fang, cut the peak of the eternal crag, and to this golden stone, this turquoise stone, she also tied the souls of the brother and sister, the progeny of the Hla, the gods. Moreover, it was made into the stone on the right. During their lifetimes, it shall be the support of the propensity to good fortune, and after death, it shall be the support of their soul and mind. Here you shall preserve the mind of the owner of the soul. She then went to the border of being and non-being. She met the stone, the tree, and the bird, those three. The tree was called a substitute of the male. This is how the so-called juniper came into being. The stone was called the substitute of the female, and in that way it came to be called stone. The vulture was made the substitute of the elder brother, and in that way it was called vulture. These three were the progeny of the realm of the sky and the earth. She slept there for one night and then woke up. She cried out from afar in anguish. The cuckoo, the crane, and the deer heard her, or, it's not clear, the crane and the deer heard the cuckoo. Not clear. And the call was retained as a sign of completeness or abundance. Her tears dropped right on the tree and the stone, and from there came the red heartwood of the juniper and the patina of the stone. Moreover, at death, the soul stone and the head tree will benefit others. Thereafter, from the top of the sal tree, she went to supplement the source of human existence. She obtained a human birth on the earth. She remembered the human brother. She also spread the human lineages on earth. She also kept the recitations or the myths of the funeral rituals of the dead. This soul of the deceased was called and summoned into the right soul longstone support, which had been set up to guard its mind. The relatives and friends affectionately met the dead person. Now, although passages of this extraordinary myth are susceptible to several interpretations owing to the archaic nature of the Tibetan text and the numerous irregularities of orthography and grammar, the essential features are clear. Here we have a case of a divinity described as a si, a vampire, even her name is sharp female fang, descending from heaven not to prey on humans, but to increase their vitality and fertility during their lifetimes and to care for their souls after their death. Now, several points to be made here. First, can we see here a variant of the well-known account of the descent of the first king, Nyati Tsempo, from heaven? I quote from a well-known Dunhuang source. He came from the heights of heaven, came as the Lord protector on the face of the earth, came as rain which covers the face of the earth. He came to the holy mountain Gyando, and the great massy mountains bowed low, bowed low. The trees came together, the rocky boulders did him honor, and the cranes made him salutation. This is Snellgrove and Richardson's translation. And there are certain parallels in the two accounts that are worth pointing out. The vampire, or goddess, is classed as a si. Nyati Tsempo descends from the Sipa gods. Both accounts feature trees, rocks, and cranes. The tears shed by the vampire are a sign of abundance. Nyati Tsempo comes in the form of timely rain. These shared motifs may be significant, or they may not. On a number of occasions above, we've seen the close similarity between the terms for the predator and the prey. Ji, mouse, one of the forms of the vampire, versus Ji, meaning child. She, meaning weasel, and she, vampire, or she and she, vampire, versus Shiu, child, among other things, as well as the related but opposed meanings of si and si, highlighted by Stein. Now, this phenomenon isn't merely nominal, but extends to physical characteristics. Elsewhere, I've discussed the condition of what I've called conflated personhood in a range of Tibetan reputations, including the fact that the Chungsi, the particular type of vampire that preys on infants, are themselves depicted as small children. So, one of the numerous frustrating features of the Soul Stone text is the uncertainty over whether or not the vampire has the form of a cuckoo. She does alight on top of a tree, and she does have a plaintive call, but the next sentence in the text is ambiguous as to whether she herself is the cuckoo or whether the cuckoo is merely one of the creatures that hears her. If she is indeed a cuckoo, then she would be a particularly salient example of a composite of antagonistic characteristics. The cuckoo is well known in Tibetan songs and poetry as being the queen of the spring and the harbinger of abundance. This is a condensed version of a well-known Tibetan folk song that celebrates the bird. I don't think I need to read it all, but the idea is clear. It's the sort of chain reaction. The sun shines in the east, the snow mountain in the west melts, the water runs, the sandalwood tree grows, the cuckoo alights, and thanks to the presence of the cuckoo, there is abundance and fertility on earth. But there is, of course, another well-known characteristic of the bird that is not mentioned in songs, but is nevertheless well known to Tibetans. The cuckoo is a nest invader. It's a parasite. It lays its egg in the nests of other birds, and after the baby cuckoo has hatched out, it kills all the other chicks by evicting them from the nest, and is reared by their unknowing mother as the sole survivor of the brood, as if it were her own. So a few words by way of a conclusion. So vampire subjugation, shinen, is a ritual for which we have documentary evidence extending over 12 centuries to the very earliest period of the Tibetan literary record. The dominant motif in that brief mention, namely that the pressing down of the sea is a complementary exercise to the worshipping of the gods above, is one that has remained constant to the present day. However, the inscription in question gives no details about the protocol of the ritual, the charter myth, the mung behind it, or the habits and appearance of the vampires that are to be subjugated. Later texts concerning the ritual are far from homogeneous. In relatively recent Buddhist versions, the vampire is both merely bad and entirely powerless in the face of an equally two-dimensional hero. The textual evidence supports the notion that this caricatural good versus evil scenario is a simplification of a less Buddhist, more indigenous version, in which the vampire is not uncompromisingly bad and the hero neither all-powerful and omniscient, nor, perhaps, entirely good. However, this doesn't allow us to draw the conclusion that the Buddhicization of the story has been responsible for the removal of nuances in the nature of the vampire. After all, a version that bears no trace of Buddhist influence represents the vampire as an unequivocally evil creature, an anthropophagus weasel, with no redeeming human features. The moral simplification of the sea is clearly not a linear process. By the same token, we can't say that the disturbingly sympathetic character of the young vampire, lovely uncared-for girl, belongs to an earlier indigenous version. Its resonance with the Kammagara account from Nepal of Ramapuransan and the 9 witches may not point to a common ancestral version, but might instead be a cultural loan, a Himalayan contamination of a Tibetan story. If lovely uncared-for girl is a somewhat tragic figure who elicits our sympathies, the same cannot be said for the 9 animal-headed vampire siblings who are somehow, we are never really sure how, related to her. At present, we have no way of knowing whether there's any connection between the Tibetan animal-headed vampires and the 16 Khotanese goddesses, and if there is, the direction in which the influence traveled. However, the fact that they may be life-preserving goddesses does resonate with the Tibetan figure of the celestial vampire who, rather than abducting human souls, preserves and nurtures them. Each of the subsections of this presentation has shown an aspect of the shinen ritual complex. In a few instances, we're fortunate enough to have clear documentary evidence of the relationship between one aspect and another. This is the case, for example, with the use of the linga, the effigy. Thanks to the statement of one of our authors, we know that this was not originally part of the performance, but came to be incorporated into it at some unspecified period. For the most part, however, even though the elements seem to form fairly distinct clusters, we can't really see how they're connected. The branches are still just shadows on the ground. Thank you.